a June night in 1841, Colonel Edmund Thornhill brought his household slaves to the drawing parlor of his Dallas County farm and made an announcement that left them speechless. His wife, Virginia, who weighed over 400 kilo and could scarcely leave her chair, would be placed under the care of Silas, a dwarf slave he had purchased 3 months ago for the particular sum of $400. What the household did not know, what would only be uncovered decades later through records found sealed in a Charleston vault, was that this was not an act of cruelty or crazy. It was the first stage of a medical experiment so disturbing that 7 people had already died in its development, and a secret society of wealthy Southerners had invested thousands of dollars waiting for its success. The Society of Medical Inquiry kept meticulous records, and those records reveal exactly what Colonel Thornhill believed would happen when he gave his dying wife to a slave whose blood he was convinced held the key to her salvation. Before we continue with the story of Thornhill Manor and the nightmare that unfolded behind its closed doors, make sure to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell. And tell us in the comments what state or city are you listening from. Now let us descend into one of Alabama's darkest and most carefully hidden secrets. What happened in the weeks following that announcement would shock even the colonel himself, and the truth would be buried for generations. Colonel Edmund Thornhill returned to Dallas County in late February 1839, his left arm stiff from a Creek warrior's tomahawk that had shattered bone at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend 25 years prior. The wound had never properly healed, leaving him with a permanent reminder of Andrew Jackson's campaign and a morphine dependency that local physicians whispered about in private. At 52, Thornhill carried himself with the rigid bearing of military discipline, his gray eyes continually narrowed as if studying enemy territory. His estate, received from his father-in-law after the old man's fortunate death from apoplexy in 1837, extended across 1,800 acres of fertile cotton land along the Alabama River. The manor itself rose 3 floors from the red clay land, a Greek revival structure with intimidating white columns that seemed to judge anyone approaching up the long oak-lined road. Locals called it Thornhill Manor, though the property deed still bore the name Ridgemont, a detail that would later prove significant. The house contained 23 rooms, most of which remained closed and unused, their furniture draped in white sheets like shrouded corpses. The basement, which stretched considerably deeper than necessary for a conventional root cellar, was absolutely off-limits to all home slaves, except for 2 trusted men who never spoke of what they saw below. Dallas County in 1839 was a land of tight hierarchies and unstated regulations. The county seat of Cahaba, situated at the confluence of the Alabama and Cahaba rivers, had briefly served as Alabama's state capital before flooding drove the government to Montgomery. The exodus left Cahaba with a strange character, a town of faded grandeur filled by former lawmakers, ambitious landowners, and the kind of men who viewed the frontier as a laboratory for social experiments. The population totaled around 4,000, with slaves outnumbering free whites by nearly 3 to 1. Cotton was king, but beneath the Gentile veneer of plantation society, darker currents flowed. Virgilia Thornhill, born Vilia Catherine Ridgemont, had once been considered the belle of mobile society. Portraits from her youth depicted a slim woman with delicate features and intelligent black eyes. But by 1839, at 41 years of age, she had transformed into something that polite society struggled to acknowledge. Her ailment, which modern science would define as a severe thyroid problem, compounded with edema, had caused her weight to inflate to an estimated $400. She could no longer climb stairs without assistance. Her breathing, especially in Alabama's suffocating summer humidity, came in labored gasps that could be heard throughout the manor's first floor. What made Virgilia's situation particularly tragic was her mind, which remained as sharp as ever. Trapped inside a body, it betrayed her with every movement. She spent her days in a specially constructed chair in the drawing room, surrounded by medical texts that she read voraciously, anxiously searching for some explanation, some remedy for her affliction. Her husband's attitude toward her had shifted from remote politeness to something that maids thought resembled clinical fascination. He watched her the way a naturalist might view a species, taking notes in a leather journal he carried everywhere. The household staff consisted of 19 slaves, most of whom worked the fields and resided in the quarters behind the main house. But 6 house servants witnessed the peculiar dynamics of the Thornhill marriage firsthand. There was Esther, the head cook, a woman in her 50s whose scarred hands testified to years of labor. Her daughter, Celia, acted as Vigilia's personal attendant, a position that demanded discretion and blind dedication. Two brothers, Marcus and Isaiah, maintained the grounds and served as the colonel's personal attendants, their faces carefully blank whenever they assisted him with his late-night trips to the basement. An elderly woman named Judith supervised the household's daily operations with calm precision, and a little girl named Penny, no more than 12, cleaned the upstairs rooms and was warned never to approach the colonel's private study. Into this odd household in March 1839 came Silas. The slave auction in Mobile took place on a humid Tuesday morning, when the air hung so heavy with moisture that men's shirt collars wilted before noon. Colonel Thornhill had gone the 100 metiers particularly for this auction, though he informed no one actual motive. The auction house, a sturdy brick building near the docks where ships from Africa and the Caribbean unloaded their human cargo, reread of unwashed bodies, fear, and the particular desperation of people being sold like livestock. Silas stood on the auction block at precisely 11:03, and the crowd's reaction was immediate. At 3 feet and 9 in tall, he was a dwarf, a condition that made him simultaneously fascinating and disturbing to the assembled planters. But what truly attracted attention was his bearing. Unlike the other slaves who kept their eyes downcast, Silas met the gaze of potential buyers with an unsettling directness. His body, albeit diminutive, was powerfully formed, his arms abnormally muscular for his small. His face, weathered beyond his 30-something years, bore a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a relic from some earlier conflict. The auctioneer, a red-faced man named Dempsey, seemed uncomfortable. "This guy is Silas, brought up from the Creole auctions in New Orleans. Previous owner was a Dr. Beauchamp of Louisiana, deceased under unfortunate circumstances. Silas is literate, speaks French and English, has knowledge of medicinal herbs and various other specific skills." That phrase, "other specialized skills," caused murmurs in the crowd. Several planters exchanged eyes and moved away. In the slave economy of 1839, certain euphemisms carried dark implications. A literate slave was dangerous. One with particular skills was possibly fatal. But Colonel Thornhill stepped forward, his face betraying no emotion. "What precisely are these specialized skills, Mr. Dempsey?" The auctioneer bent down, reducing his voice, though several others could still hear. "The previous owner used him for breeding purposes. Colonel claims he sired 17 children, all healthy, all valuable. Also says he has knowledge of anatomy and medical processes. Assisted the doctor in his profession. Some doubt regarding the nature of that procedure, which is why we are selling him cheap." Thornhill's eyes narrowed with intrigue. "How cheap?" $400, sir. Half what you would pay for a prime field hand considering his physical limitations." The bidding was brief. A planter from Montgomery offered $300. Another went to $350. But when Thornhill called out $400 in a voice that beaked no competition, the others fell silent. Money changed hands, papers were signed, and by noon Silas was shackled in the back of Thornhill's wagon, beginning the long journey to Dallas County. They journeyed for 3 days, stopping at roadside taverns where Silas remained tied in the wagon bed. Thornhill rarely spoke to his new acquisition, except to give water and hard crackers. But on the second night, camped beside the road under a moon that turned the Alabama landscape silver and strange, the colonel finally broke his silence. "Can you truly read, Silas?" "Yes, master." The voice was deep, incongruous, coming from such a little physique with an accent that suggested erudition beyond what any slave should possess, and your knowledge of medicine. "Is that accurate, or was Dempsey exaggerating your value?" Silas tilted his head, meeting Thornhill's gaze in the firelight. "Dr. Beauchamp trained me for 8 years, master. He considered that small hands were advantageous for certain delicate processes. I assisted in over 200 surgeries before his death." "And what caused his death?" "Yellow fever, master. Same epidemic that killed half of New Orleans in 37. Thornhill studied him for a long moment. "You are lying. I verified the death records before I got to Mobile. Dr. Henry Beauchamp died of arsenic poisoning. The inquest could not determine if it was accidental or murder. You were sold by his widow precisely to remove you from New Orleans before certain questions could be answered." Silas said nothing, but something flickered in his eyes. Something that might have been respect for the colonel's thoroughness, or perhaps recognition of a kindred calculating intelligence. "I do not care what happened in New Orleans," Thornhill continued. "That is the past. What matters is what you can do for me. I have work that requires discretion, intelligence, and a strong stomach. Do you possess those qualities? What kind of work, master? Medical work, experimental in character. You will assist me, and in return you will receive a private room in the mansion, better food than field slaves, and access to my medical library. You will also have certain privileges that others do not enjoy, but you will speak to no one about what we do. If you betray my confidence, your death will be slow and creative. Do we understand each other? Yes, master. Good. Thornhill leaned back, his wounded arm cradled against his chest. When we arrive at the manor, you will meet my wife. You will be respectful, obedient, and attentive to her needs. She suffers from a condition that conventional medicine cannot cure. I intend to try unconventional methods. They arrived at Thornhill Manor on a Thursday afternoon, as storm clouds collected on the horizon and the air crackled with pretorm electricity. The household slaves came out to meet the wagon, their faces carefully neutral as they regarded the new arrival. Silas, now unchained but painfully aware that escaping into the surrounding countryside would be suicidal for someone of his distinguishing appearance, climbed down and waiting for instructions. Vigilia Thornhill met him in the drawing room, seated in her reinforced chair near the window where afternoon light lit her with terrible clarity. She wore a dress of deep green silk that had been specifically created to accommodate her size, and her hair, still thick and dark despite her age, was done in an ornate style that suggested vanity had not totally died within her. "So this is the one," she continued, her voice surprisingly melodic. She observed Silas with the same clinical detachment her husband had showed. "Come closer. Let me see you fully." Silas obeyed, moving into the light. At his height, he was practically at eye level with Vigilia, despite her seated position. She stretched out and grasped his chin in her palm, twisting his face side to side, studying him like a horse buyer, checking teeth. "Edmund says you have medical knowledge." "Yes, mistress, and breeding capabilities." Her tone was matter of fact, discussing him as one might discuss livestock genetics. 17 children, I am informed, all healthy. "So I have been informed, mistress. I never met most of them. They were sold shortly after birth." Something flickered across Vigilia's face, an emotion too rapid to identify. "Of course they were. That is the nature of our unusual institution, is it not? But we are not interested in children, Silas. We have different goals. My husband has explained nothing to you, I guess." "No, mistress." Typical Edmund. He enjoys his mysteries. She released his chin and sat back. Her breathing struggled from even that modest exertion. "I am dying, Silas, slowly, certainly, but inevitably. This body is destroying itself, growing larger and weaker with each passing month. Conventional doctors give leeches and mercury, prayer and resignation. But my spouse and I believe there are other alternatives. Older knowledge, experimental procedures, methods that the medical establishment considers unethical or even heretical." Colonel Thornhill entered the room, his boots clicking on the smooth floor. "That is enough for now, Vilia. Silas needs to see his quarters and understand his duties before we discuss theory." "Theory?" Vigilia laughed, a sound that melted into choking. "Is that what we are calling it, Edmund? How delightfully academic." Thornhill's jaw tightened. "Celia, show Silas to the small room off the kitchen." "Off. He will take his meals with the home staff and attend me in my study each morning at 6 sharp. Silas, you are dismissed." But as Silas followed Celia out, he heard Vigilia's voice, lower now, speaking to her husband. "He is perfect, Edmund. Exactly what we need. When do we begin?" "Soon, my dear, very soon." The room Silas was given had formerly been a pantry, barely large enough for the narrow bed and little table it now held, but it had a lock on the inside, a luxury no field slave would ever know, and a window that overlooked the kitchen garden. More importantly, it was near the basement door, and in the nights that followed, Silas would lie awake listening to sounds that drifted up from below. Footsteps, muffled voices, and occasionally a sound that might have been crying or might have been something else entirely. His duties began simply enough. Each morning he attended Colonel Thornhill in the study, a chamber lined with bookcases housing texts on medicine, anatomy, natural philosophy, and things more arcane. Thornhill would dictate notes while Silas wrote in a clear hand, documenting observations about Vigilia's condition, her weight recorded on a special scale brought from Mobile, her food intake meticulously monitored, her breathing patterns, the swelling in her ankles, the quality of her sleep. But there were other notebooks too, older ones that Thornhill sometimes consulted but never let Silas touch. Their leather covers were soiled with liquids that might have been ink or might have been blood. and the glimpses Silas caught of their contents showed anatomical drawings of a precision and detail that suggested first-hand observation of a disturbing nature. "You are wondering about my methods," Thornhill said one morning, catching Silas staring at one of the closed notebooks. "That is natural. Curiosity is the mark of intelligence. But you must understand something, Silas. Medicine, as it is currently done, is barbaric. Leeches and laudanum, prayer and ignorance. The human body is a machine. Complex, yes, but eventually understandable. The ancients knew this. The Egyptians, the Greeks, they studied anatomy by first-hand observation. But then came the dark periods of Christian morality, where touching a corpse was sin and knowing was heresy." He pulled down one of the older volumes, its pages yellowed with age. "There are men in Europe even now who understand that progress requires sacrifice, who recognize that some knowledge can only be gained through methods that society considers immoral. I studied with one such guy in Charleston before the war, Dr. Nathaniel Rutledge, Constance's father. He taught me that the boundaries between life and death, health and disease are more fluid than we imagine, that with the right techniques, the right understanding, we can transfer vitality from one vessel to another." Silas kept his face deliberately neutral. "Transfer vitality, Master. Have you never wondered why some people thrive while others rot away? Why a child can survive injuries that would kill an adult? Or why some bloodlines seem cursed with illness while others flourish? It is not God's will, Silas, it is biology. And biology can be manipulated." Over the following weeks, Silas learned the true nature of his duties. He was to assist in procedures conducted in the basement laboratory, a place that had been painstakingly designed during the house's remodeling in 1837. The chamber was huge, unexpectedly well lit by many oil lamps, and equipped with a level of medical expertise that would have surprised any surgeon of the era. There were examining tables with leather restraints, cupboards housing surgical instruments of sparkling steel, glass vials holding specimens kept in alcohol, and an entire wall of comprehensive anatomical charts. But it was the other equipment that disclosed the genuine function of this area. Strange apparatus of brass and wood created to measure and manipulate the human body in ways that had no valid medical purpose. Devices for bloodletting that could drain a person to the point of death and then theoretically reverse the process. Complicated systems of tubes and pumps that suggested transfusion or something even more disturbing. "We begin with simple observation," Thornhill explained during Silas's first visit to the laboratory. "We must establish baseline measures for both participants before we can try any transmission." "Both subjects, Master." Thornhill smiled, an emotion that never reached his eyes. "You do not think this is solely about my wife, do you?" "No, Silas, this is about testing a theory. If vitality can be transmitted, if the life force, the essential energy that some call the humerus and others call the vital spirit, if that can be conveyed from one body to another, then we must have a giver and a recipient. Villia will be the recipient. You, my bright friend, are the donor." The room seemed to grow colder. Silas kept his voice steady. "You mean to kill me, Master?" Silas kept his voice steady. "You mean to kill me, Master?" "Kill you? No, that would be wasteful. The process, if it succeeds, should not be fatal to either party." Dr. Rutledge's studies revealed that vitality might be transmitted, distributed in measured amounts like blood in a transfusion. You will be weakened, certainly, but you will recover and the process can be repeated. Think of it as donating blood, except instead of blood, we are transmitting something more essential. And if it does not work, then we will have learned something valuable and we will try again with modifications. Science, Silas, is based on failure. Each failing attempt brings us closer to success. What Thornhill did not say, what Silas grasped with cold clarity, was that alterations likely implied experimentation on other patients. And suddenly the question that had been haunting him since Mobile gained terrible significance. What happened to the 7 other dwarfs who had gone from auction records across the Deep South? That night, alone in his little room, Silas made a decision. He would play along, learn everything he could about Thornhill's experiments and the network that supported them, and he would find a way to live. He had survived Dr. Beauchamp's medical career in New Orleans, survived long enough to ensure the man died choking on his own vomit. After Silas had carefully docked his evening cognac with the right combination of emetics and toxins, he would survive this too. But as he lay in the darkness, listening to footsteps descending to the basement laboratory, listening to Vigilia's labored breathing as she was helped down the stairs by Celia and Marcus, Silas wondered how many others had laid in similar rooms in similar estates across the South, planning similar schemes that never came to reality. The experiments were about to commence, and with them a plunge into horror that would make Dr. Bam's crime seem almost merciful by comparison. 3 weeks after Silas's arrival, a visitor came to Thornhill Manor. Dr. Constance Rutledge arrived in an elegant black carriage on a Wednesday morning when the smell of magnolia blossoms hung thick in the air. At 57, Rutledge was tall and rail-thin, with a beard gone practically white, and eyes of such pale blue they seemed almost colorless. He carried himself with the authority of a man accustomed to deference, and the household slaves instinctively lowered their gaze when he passed. Silas, gazing from the kitchen window as he helped Esther prepare the noon meal, saw the wooden cases that Marcus and Isaiah carefully unloaded from the carriage. Both men had to carry the large containers, which were devoid of any marks or labels. They were led straight to the laboratory in the basement. "That is the devil himself," Esther whispered, her hands never stopping their work chopping vegetables. "Been coming here since before Miss Vigilia got sick. Some say he is the one made her sick in the first place with his potions and powders." "Why would he do that?" Silas asked, keeping his tone casual. Esther glanced toward the door, ensuring they were alone for his experiments. "That is what folks say. She was not always big like this. Got sick after the colonel came back from Charleston after he spent those 3 months studying with Dr. Rutledge's father. Came back with ideas, with equipment, with ambitions. Miss Vigilia, she went along with it at first. Thought they could cure anything, make themselves immortal or some such foolishness, but then she started changing, swelling up, getting weaker. Now she cannot even leave that chair most days. And the doctor still comes, still brings his equipment, still goes down to that basement with the colonel. And other men come too in the night when respectable folk are asleep. I have seen their vehicles, elegant carriages from Mobile and Montgomery, even from as far as Charleston. They arrive, they go down to the basement, they go before daylight. And occasionally sometimes people disappear. Slaves mostly, bought at auction, brought here and then gone. The colonel says he sold them, sent them to other plantations. But Marcus, he has heard things. Sounds coming from below. That ain't the sounds of doctoring." Before Silas could respond, Celia entered the kitchen, her face carefully blank. "Silas, the colonel wants you in the study." How the study smelled of tobacco and old leather. Colonel Thornhill stood by the window, Dr. Rutledge beside him, both men turning as Silas entered. Rutledge's pale eyes fixed on him with an intensity that was almost physical. "So this is the specimen," Rutledge said, circling Silas like a buyer at an auction. "Excellent musculature for his size. The previous owner trained him well. And you say he is literate, genuinely literate, not just trained to recognize a few words." "Test him yourself," Thornhill replied. Rutledge pulled a medical text from the shelf, opened it to a random page and thrust it at Silas. Read this passage out loud. Silas read a dense paragraph about the treatment of surating wounds, pronouncing even the Latin terminology correctly. Rutledge's eyebrows rose. "Remarkable. And he assisted in surgeries." "You said according to his previous owner's records, yes. Over 200 procedures. Even more remarkable. Tell me, Silas, do you understand what we are attempting here?" Silas chose his words carefully. "The master says you believe vitality can be transferred between individuals, doctor. That the life force is not fixed but can be manipulated through medical intervention." Rutledge smiled, an expression that transformed his severe face into something almost animated. "He understands. Edmund, this is perfect. Not just a donor, but an intelligent observer who can articulate his experience during the process. This could yield invaluable data." "That was my opinion." Thornhill concurred. "If the operation generates discomfort or sensation that might imply efficacy, Silas can describe it in detail. Assuming he remains aware, the pain might be considerable." Rutledge observed Silas with increased interest. "How is your pain tolerance, boy? Can you retain composure under duress?" "I have been a slave for 31 years, doctor. I have learned to suffer." "Good. Because what we are going to undertake has never been properly completed. Oh, there have been experiments conducted by the Society of Medical Inquiry going back decades. My father was among the founding members, and his research forms the basis for our current approach. But the technique requires precision, timing, and a willingness to push beyond the boundaries that squeamish men call ethics." He walked to Thornhill's desk and unrolled a large anatomical chart covered in handwritten notes and diagrams. Silas, despite himself, moved closer to see. The chart depicted 2 human figures connected by an elaborate system of tubes and needles. Notes in meticulous handwriting described a process that seemed to combine bloodletting, transfusion, and something more esoteric, involving humoral balance and vital essence transfer. The theoretical basis drew from ancient medicine, medieval alchemy, and what seemed to be original research conducted on subjects whose consent was clearly never considered. We begin with bloodletting, Rutledge explained, his finger tracing the diagram, but not the barbaric leeching that common physicians employ. Precise measurement. Exact quantities calculated based on body weight and humoral composition. We drain blood from the donor here and here. He pointed to marked locations on the diagram's arms and legs. Simultaneously, we administer a tonic to the recipient, a preparation of my own design containing mercury, belladonna, and certain herbs known to indigenous peoples of the Americas. This tonic opens what I call the vital channels, making the recipient's body receptive to new vitality. Then comes the transfer. Using graduated transfusion, we introduce the donor's blood into the recipient's system. But it is not merely blood we are transferring. The tonic and the ritual timing conducted according to lunar phases and humoral correspondences allow us to transfer something more essential. Call it life force, call it vital energy, call it what you will. The ancients understood that some people possess concentrated vitality, and that this vitality can be harvested. Silas kept his voice neutral, and the donor survives this process. In theory, sure. Though I will not lie to you, boy. The 7 prior attempts had varied results. 3 individuals died during the process itself. Cardiac failure brought on by significant blood loss. 2 survived but were left in a terribly weakened state, useless for further experimentation. They were disposed of. 1 subject developed a violent fever and died 3 days after the procedure. And 1, most interesting, seemed to survive relatively intact but developed a peculiar madness, claiming he could feel pieces of himself living inside the recipient. He had to be put down before he became dangerous. Encouraging odds, Silas stated dryly, garnering harsh stares from both men. Rutledge laughed. He has spirit. I like that. Spirit signifies great life. Edmund, he will make a good donor, but we must be careful. Edmund, he will make a good donor, but we must be careful. The Society has invested considerable resources in this research, and they expect results. Success here could lead to breakthroughs that will transform medicine. Imagine a world where the young and vital could extend the lives of the wealthy and wise, where senators and presidents need not fear age or disease because they have access to renewal through controlled transfer. The implications for society are staggering. When do you wish to proceed? Thornhill inquired. The new moon is in 6 days. That provides perfect conditions according to the humoral calendar. We will need the recipient prepared. The donor prepared in absolute secrecy. No household slaves can know the exact timing or see the surgery itself. Can you assure discretion? Marcus and Isaiah are faithful. They will guard the doors and ensure no one disrupts. And your wife, is she prepared? Vigilia understands what we are attempting. She is eager to begin. Rutledge nodded slowly. Then we proceed in 6 days. I will return the day before with the final equipment and tonics. In the meantime, Edmund, keep the donor well-fed and healthy. We need him at peak vitality for the transfer to have optimum effect. Any weakness or disease in him could endanger the entire procedure. As Silas was dismissed and returned to the kitchen, his mind raced. Days. He had 6 days to decide whether to attempt escape, knowing that as a dwarf slave running through rural Alabama, he would be captured within hours, or to submit to a procedure that had a 7-8 failure rate resulting in death or worse. But there was a third option, one that Dr. Beauchamp had taught him through bitter experience. If you cannot escape and you cannot refuse, then you manipulate the situation to your advantage. You watch, you learn, you wait for the moment when your captor's confidence makes them careless, and then you strike. That night, Silas began preparing. His room contained little, but what he had was enough. A small knife used for cutting vegetables smuggled from the kitchen. A bottle of laudanum he had palmed from Thornhill's study when the colonel's attention was elsewhere. And most importantly, his mind, which held knowledge that Beauchamp had imparted during 8 years of training. Knowledge of anatomy and toxicology that most physicians never learned. He also began listening more carefully to the house, mapping its rhythms and secrets. The basement laboratory could be reached by 2 routes. The obvious door off the kitchen and a second entrance from the colonel's ground floor bedroom. A door concealed behind a bookshelf. The laboratory itself had no windows, but the ventilation system necessary to remove the fumes from chemical experiments led to a grating on the north side of the house. And most tellingly, Silas discovered that he was not the only one making preparations. On the third night before the scheduled procedure, he woke to sounds of movement in the house. Creeping to his door, he peered out to see Celia descending to the basement carrying fresh linens. An hour later, she emerged looking shaken, her hands trembling as she climbed back to the upper floor. The next morning, Silas found a moment alone with her in the wash house. "You saw something," he said quietly. "Last night." Celia's eyes widened with fear. "I cannot talk about it. The colonel will have me whipped if I say anything. I am going to be in that basement in 3 days, Celia. Whatever you saw, I need to know." She peered around, sure they were alone, then leaned near. "There are cages down there, Silas. Iron cages constructed into the walls, and in one of them there is a guy, or what is remained of a man. He cannot speak, cannot do anything but gaze. His skin is wrong, covered in marks like he has been cut open and sewn back up dozens of times. The colonel says he is a failed experiment, kept alive for observation. When I brought the linens, Dr. Rutledge was measuring him, keeping notes about how long he had survived in his current state." "How long has he been there?" "I do not know. Months at least, maybe longer. Silas, they are going to do worse to you." I had heard them conversing. "This is not about curing Miss Vigilia. This is about something else. Something they call the ultimate experiment. They talk about it like preachers talk about salvation, like it is the most essential thing in the world. And they do not care who dies to achieve it." Silas absorbed this information, felt his options reduce more. If there was already a subject being kept in the basement, a failed experiment, then Thornhill and Rutledge had gone far beyond theoretical research. They were conducting systematic human experimentation, and the Society of Medical Inquiry, whatever that organization was, supported and funded their work. "Celia, if something happens to me, if the procedure goes wrong, you need to tell people what you have seen. Tell the other slaves. Tell anybody who will listen." She shook her head violently. "No one will believe a slave's word against the colonel's. Even if they did, the society would protect him. They have members in every major city in the South, judges and politicians and affluent guys. Marcus says they are like the Freemasons, but worse. A secret society devoted to this perverse medical research. They protect each other, cover up scandals, make evidence disappear. If I talk, I will just disappear too." She was right, and Silas knew it. Whatever happened in that basement in 3 days, the truth would be buried along with any victims, unless he could find a way not just to survive, but to expose what was happening in a way that could not be ignored or suppressed. The difficulty was he had no idea how to do that. Not quite yet. The day of the procedure dawned gray and oppressive, the air so thick with humidity that breathing felt like drowning. Storm clouds formed on the horizon but never came closer, as if even the weather was holding its breath. Silas was awakened before morning by Marcus, who silently escorted him to the basement laboratory. The space had been altered. Additional lamps created a harsh, almost operating theater brightness. The examination tables, 2 of them now, were positioned side by side with barely 3 feet between them. A sophisticated network comprising brass tubes, glass reservoirs, and rubber hoses connected the tables, the whole contraption looking like some nightmarish musical instrument designed by a madman. Dr. Rutledge was already present, putting surgical instruments on a cloth-covered tray. He wore a leather apron smeared with ancient blood, and his sleeves were pushed up to reveal forearms crisscrossed with old scars. Colonel Thornhill stood nearby, reviewing handwritten notes in one of his leather-bound journals. "Ah, our donor arrives," Rutledge said without looking up. "Strip to the waist and lie on the table to the left. Marcus, secure him." Silas obeyed, knowing resistance was fruitless. The leather restraints were secured around his wrists, ankles, and across his chest, tight enough to prohibit movement, but not so tight as to cut off circulation. Yet Vigilia was brought down 20 minutes later, supported between Celia and Isaiah. Her breathing labored with the exertion of climbing the steps. She wore a plain white cotton gown, her hair loose over her shoulders, and her face had an expression that Silas could not quite identify. It was not fear, not exactly. It was anticipation mingled with something deeper, a hunger that made her eyes glitter in the lamplight. At last she whispered as they assisted her onto the second table. "Edmund, are you certain this will work?" "As definite as science allows, my darling. Dr. Rutledge has honed the process based on prior tries. Your chances of success are significantly improved." "And his chances?" She glanced at Silas with what might have been sympathy, or might have been the way a diner looks at a meal. "Adequate," Rutledge remarked dismissively. "We have computed the blood volume carefully. He should survive, though he will be weakened for some weeks afterward." ought to endure. The nonchalant manner of the appraisal made Silas's blood run cold, but he kept his face emotionless. He had learnt long ago that displaying fear only promoted cruelty. Rutland began his preparations with deliberate precision. First, he provided a dose of laudanum to both individuals, enough to dull pain without inducing unconsciousness. Silas felt the familiar warmth spreading through his limbs, the slight detachment that came with the drug. Then came a series of measurements. Heart rate, breathing, body temperature taken with a mercury thermometer. His vitals are fine, Rutland reported. Pulse strong and steady at 68 beats per minute. The donor is in optimal condition, and the recipient Thornhill, who had been examining Vigilia, examined his notes. Pulse high at 92, breathing laborious but stable. She's prepared. Then we start. Marcus, Isaiah, take your positions at the doors. No one enters under any circumstances. If anyone attempts to interrupt, you have authorization to use whatever force is required. The two slaves nodded and departed, their footsteps echoing on the stairs. Celia was removed as well, leaving only the three principals and their unwilling patient in the laboratory's harsh light. Rutland opened one of the wooden crates he had brought, displaying rows of glass vials containing liquids of varied hues. He selected 3 and began mixing them in a graduated beaker, his actions exact and trained. The resulting liquid was a deep amber color that seemed to glow in the lamplight. The tonic, he said, though Silas believed he was speaking more for his personal gratification than for any instructional purpose. 40 grains of mercury in suspended solution, extract of belladonna, carefully measured to enlarge the vital channels without triggering fatal arrhythmia, and a tincture made from a plant the Cherokee call ghostweed, which opens the barrier between physical and vital energies. He approached Vigilia first, holding the beaker to her lips. Have it all, sweetheart. Now hurry up before the temperature drops. Vigilia drank without hesitation, grimacing at what must have been a bitter taste. Within moments her pupils began to dilate, growing so large that her eyes looked almost black. Her respiration, already difficult, became fast and shallow. Excellent response, Rutland noted, checking his pocket watch. The effect of the tonic is underway. We are now getting the donor ready. He moved to Silas's table, selecting a scalpel from his tray of instruments. I'm going to make 4 incisions, 1 in each limb, positioned across key blood veins. The cuts will be deep enough to enable significant blood flow, but controlled enough to prevent rapid exsanguination. You will experience discomfort despite the laudanum. You get it? Indeed. Silas kept his mouth shut. Excellent, avoid thrashing. The restraints will keep you in place, but if you move too much, the incisions may tear unevenly, making the process more difficult. The initial wound in Silas's crook on his flesh, his left arm, felt like a line of fire. The pain was acute and immediate even with the laudanum. Refusing to scream, he bit down hard. He knew it was coming, so the second cut on his right arm hurt more. Both wounds gushed blood, which was directed into the glass reservoirs of Rutledge's equipment by metal guides. Even in the Lord's haze, Silas sensed consciousness slipping as the deeper leg incisions targeted the femoral vessels. Sound seemed to get muted and farther away as the laboratory appeared to darken at the borders. With his fingers on Silas's wrist, Thornhill reported that his heart rate had decreased. 62, 58, 54. As anticipated, we will start the transfusion after letting him drain until we reach 48. Get the recipient ready, Edmund. Though Vigilia's cuts were shallower and intended to accept rather than release, Silas saw through blurred vision as Thornhill made similar incisions in her arms. As the blade sliced through her flesh, she gasped, but there was a hint of pleasure in the sound. Rutledge whispered, "The tonic is working beautifully," taking Vigilia's pulse and looking at her dilated pupils. "She has open vital passages. The transfer will be made to her as efficiently as possible." Time grew elastic, wildly expanding and contracting. Silas could feel his blood draining from his body and his limbs becoming weaker like ice water. Rutledge measured and tracked the dark red liquid-filled glass reservoirs with obsessive precision. "It's 48 beats per minute," Thornhill declared. "The threshold has been crossed. Start the transfusion." Rutledge gave the order. After adjusting the device and turning the valves, Silas's blood started to flow through the brass tubes in the direction, the table of Vigilia. However, the transfusion was not straightforward. Silas could not identify the compounds in the chambers that the blood went through, treatments that made it appear brighter, almost dazzling instead of dark red. Rutledge told himself more than anybody else that the purifying procedure takes away the donor's unique essence. All that is left is unadulterated vitality, untarnished by the identity of the donor. This makes it possible for the recipient to accept the life force without being turned away. With her back arching against the restraints and her respiration quickening to the point of hyperventilation, Vigilia groaned as the treated blood entered her veins. It was chilly in the basement, yet her forehead was beaded with sweat. Edmund's heart rate increased from 112. Excellent, integration is taking place. The vitality is recognized by her body, which attracts it. Keep going. For a discernible impact, we must transfer a minimum of 3 pints. Through great eyesight, Silas observed as his life and blood poured into Vilia's body. His tongue felt heavy and unhelpful as he attempted to protest. Slowly, the lab whirled and he heard a sound he could not immediately place. It was familiar, persistent, and rhythmic. His own heartbeat, which was 40 beats per minute, slowed with each pulse. T5:30. "Doctor," Thornhill said, a note of alarm in his voice. "The donor is getting close to the crucial point." "A little bit more. The necessary volume is so near." "He's getting blue lips." "Edmund, another half pint." "To finish the process, we need one more half pint." "He's dying." "Then he sacrifices his life for scientific progress." "Another half hour." "I just need that." However, Thornhill was already in motion, his hands fumbling with the valves of the apparatus. "No, this is sufficient. If we don't stop now, we risk losing him completely, which would leave us without a donor for any upcoming procedures." Rutledge's expression contorted in annoyance. He didn't argue, though. The tubes were unplugged and the flow was halted. Silas sensed pressure being applied to the wounds and bandages being wrapped around his limbs. Thornhill could feel someone pushing a thick, sweet liquid, possibly honey water or some sort of therapeutic preparation, between his lips. He is regulating his heart rate. According to Thornhill, 42 beats, 46 and 50, he will live. After that, we wait. According to Rutledge, his focus has already completely turned to Vigilia. We now watch the recipient and record the results. Vigilia was lying on her table, breathing slowly and with her eyes closed, reducing its frantic speed. There was a tinge of color to her skin, which had been waxy and pale for months. The rhythm of the rise and fall of her chest looked less strained than previously. "Edmund," she said in a whisper, "I have a feeling. It feels like spring water rushing through frozen water as it warms my body. The ground. I feel more resilient. I feel alive." Leaning over her, Rutledge took her pulse, looked into her eyes, and quickly took notes in his journal. "Amazing. Her pulse has decreased from 128 to 86, stabilizing. There is more regular and deeper breathing. It looks like the integration went well. When will we be able to determine whether the impacts are long-lasting?" Thornhill inquired. "Days are more likely than hours. She will require observation. Continuously. Rejection could be indicated by any negative reactions over the first 24 hours, in which case prompt action would be necessary. However, Edmund, if this is successful and she continues to improve, we will have accomplished something that no doctor in history has done. The transfer of life force from one human to another will have been accomplished." While Silas lay on his table, scarcely awake, with blood-soaked bandages wrapped around him, they carried on with their observations, measurements, and notes, all around his body. After his heart rate leveled off, no one bothered to check on him anymore. He was the source and the donor, and now that he had fulfilled his function, he was merely upkeep to be preserved for possible future use. Silas heard them enjoy their triumph through the mist of frailty and residual aldenum. He heard Vigilia talk about the feelings coursing through her body, the sense of fresh energy, and the optimism that she might truly get better. He heard Thornhill and Rutledge debate the best times to schedule follow-up appointments and figure out how much blood could be extracted without causing irreversible harm to the donor. And something that ought to have been clear from the start started to make sense to him. Curing Vigilia was never the point of this. The goal was to evaluate an approach that could be marketed to the powerful and wealthy. Consider a plantation owner prolongs his own life by taking energy from his youngest, healthiest slaves. Imagine senators and businessmen retaining their freshness and vitality by drawing life power from donors who have been carefully chosen. Rutledge had described the ramifications as horrific and staggering. Hours went by. Marcus and Isaiah eventually came back to carry Silas back to his room, where they carelessly dumped him on the narrow bed. As she attended to his wounds, Esther showed up with bandages and broth, her face meticulously blank. "Drink this," she ordered, putting a cup to his mouth. You should drink as much as you can to replenish your strength, because you have lost too much blood, the man said. How long has he been there? Esther's hands froze for a moment as Silas whispered in the cage, his voice barely audible. I can tell that it's been 9 months. He wasn't always like that. When they first brought him down, he could still talk, still beg. Still beg. He only stares now. They use tubes and force feeds to keep him alive and keep him breathing, so they can examine the effects of their experiments. What did they do? Things I can't explain, things that aren't, and it's not just him. Before you arrived, there were 7 others, all of whom were purchased at auction and vanished once the colonel and that devil doctor finished their work. That's not natural, and God never intended for one person to do that to another. Where are they now? Esther's eyes welled up with tears, but she wouldn't let them go. She was buried in the woods beyond the north field, and Marcus, who they make dig the graves, knows where they are. Silas closed his eyes, feeling the weakness in his body, the ache in his limbs where the incisions throbbed despite the bandages. He must live with what he has seen, with what he has been forced to help with. It is killing him inside, Silas. It is killing all of us. The thought was barely formed before exhaustion claimed him, pulling him down into darkness where he dreamed of the caged man's empty eyes and the sound of shovels breaking earth. 3 days passed in a blur of weakness and fever. He had survived the procedure, but 7 others had not. 7 people whose names would never be recorded in any history, whose deaths would never be investigated, and whose graves would never be marked unless someone stopped it. Despite Esther's careful tending, Silas's fever broke on the 4th day, and when he woke up, he saw Dr. Rutland standing next to his bed, examining the wounds with clinical detachment. Silas slipped in and out of consciousness, aware of Esther's hands changing his bandages, of bitter medicine thrust between his lips, and of voices discussing his condition as if he were not there. Rutland informed Thornhill, who was standing in the doorway, that the infection was responding to treatment and that he should regain full function in 2 weeks. The blood loss was significant but not irreversible, and he would be eligible for a second procedure in 6 weeks. Thornhill inquired about Vigilia, who was remarkably improved. Her breathing is much better. She has lost about 15 pounds. The edema in her ankles has decreased by almost 40%. And yesterday she was able to climb the stairs to the 2nd floor, something she hasn't been able to do in over a year. The procedure was a total success. Preliminary success, Edmund, we need. After they left, Silas realized with cold clarity what he had become. Not a slave, but livestock. A renewable resource to be harvested until his body gave out. More transfers will be needed to determine the ideal frequency. But the basic theory has been proven. Vitality can be successfully transferred from donor to recipient with measurable physiological improvement. Celia slipped in with soup as the door opened again, and after looking over her shoulder, she said in a voice that was hardly audible above a whisper, Silas, you need to regain your strength. You need to be able to move when the time comes. What time? She asked. The time when we run. This is it. Marcus and I have been preparing for months, and they will find us in a matter of hours. We are not running south. We are running north. The Underground Railroad, Silas answered understandingly. Yes, but we need something from you. Marcus has been in communication with them for months through a blacksmith in Cahaba, and we have help. People who help slaves escape. They have roots, safe houses. They will never allow us to take evidence. Therefore, we need proof of what happened here, what the Colonel and Dr. Rutland are doing. And if we can document it, bring evidence north and prove it, it might expose these monsters to the world. Thornhill's. It was compelling, and it appealed to something deeper than survival. Journals are locked in his study, but you know what they did? You can testify to it, describe it, and if we can get even one of those journals, one piece of physical evidence, it would support your testimony. Your suffering would have meaning, Silas. It would help others. When? He asked. Soon, maybe 2 weeks. They are planning something. A gathering here at the manor. Dr. Rutland mentioned other members of the society would be attending to witness a demonstration. The thought that his experience could be used as a weapon against the institution that had caused such suffering was almost intoxicating. We go when they are preoccupied with their guests and security is concentrating on the demonstration. What kind of demonstration? Celia's face turned pale as Marcus overheard them discussing the fact that they were bringing another slave, a dwarf, that they had purchased at a Montgomery auction, and that they would be performing. The process once more, but in public. They intend to use you and this new slave together. A dual transfer, taking from 2 donors at the same time. The room appeared to tilt. 2 donors meant twice as much blood loss, twice as much trauma, twice as much risk. And if the first procedure had nearly killed him, the second one would most likely kill him. He responded, "I'll be ready in 2 weeks, but Celia, if we're going to risk everything, we need more than testimony. We need one of those notebooks or something better. What could be better than the man in the cage? Bring him north as living proof of what they've done if we can." Nobody could dispute that. A human being disfigured by medical research would be evidence that could not be repressed by propaganda. Celia frantically shook her head. "Silas, he is unable to move or even speak." I am not sure how she watched him for a long time before nodding. "Yet we have 2 weeks to figure it out." "Because you are right. What is happening here is evil. And if we do nothing, if we just run and save ourselves, then 7 people have died for nothing. Marcus is coming tonight. You 2 can make plans together, but Silas, watch out. They'll kill us all if they suspect anything. They have too much invested in this job, and they have too many powerful people on their side." Silas pushed himself to eat after she left, even though he was feeling sick. He reflected on the 7 graves in the woods beyond the north field. 7 people whose names he did not know, whose stories would never be told, and who deserved better than to spend 2 weeks and 14 days preparing for an escape, with little chance of success. 12 days later, Thornhill Manor was bustling with preparation as the Society of Medical Inquiry sent 7 representatives from all over the South. Planters, doctors, and natural philosophers, all of whom were well off enough to ensure that their deaths had meaning and that they were remembered. Silas was determined to make sure they did or die trying. Pursue experiments that traditional medicine would denounce and have the strength to keep their activities under wraps. The second slave had arrived 3 days earlier, and according to the bill of sales, Silas had a glimpse of him. His name was Abel, and he was 26 years old, 4 feet tall, described as healthy, and kept in isolation on the 3rd floor while being fed well and closely watched. He was a young man with a wide face and scared eyes who looked up at footsteps with a heartbreaking expression, and Silas saw him once. 2 days prior to the event on Thursday night, Thornhill sent him to the study to retrieve a medical text, and for the first time in weeks, the room was filled with opportunity. It was empty. Silas hurried to the bookcases with the journals, which were lined up chronologically in leather-bound volumes. He picked one from 1837, 2 years prior to his arrival, and rapidly skimmed through it, the contents of which made his stomach turn. Thornhill had been conducting these experiments for at least 5 years, and the procedures were not all blood transfers. Some involved organ removal, while others tested the limits of human pain tolerance. Page after page of clinical descriptions of procedures performed on slaves whose names were only recorded as numbers. Subject 7, Subject 12, Subject 23. Detailed drawings showed incisions, measurements of blood loss, and observations of subjects' conditions as they weakened and died. Silas slipped the journal inside his shirt. It was reckless, but he needed to review it properly. Still others investigated the effects of administering different toxins in increasing doses. It was systematic torture disguised as medical research taking place at Thornhill Manor for years, while Dallas County society remained ignorant or purposefully blind. He had to find the procedures that would be most damning if they were made public, and he would return it before Thornhill realized it was gone. Silas read for hours by candlelight in his room, and Thornhill wrote about them in a methodical, clinical manner that showed no acknowledgement that the subjects were human. Livestock. Subject 19 showed unexpected resistance to mercury poisoning, requiring 3 times the expected lethal dose. Subject 14 showed remarkable pain tolerance, surviving 68 hours of continuous observation after bilateral renal removal. The list of cruelty continued, but it was also evidence, unquestionable proof of crimes written in Thornhill's own hand, that would shock even the most ardent proponents of slavery. What Thornhill documented went far beyond discipline. It was experimentation that served no practical purpose, advanced no legitimate medical knowledge, and existed only to satisfy sadistic curiosities. This is because, although Southern law gave slaveholders great latitude in disciplining their property, even the most pro-slavery judges recognized limits. On scraps of paper he had scrounged, he copied important passages, memorized others, and studied the anatomical drawings. realizing for the first time the full extent of what the Society of Medical Inquiry was trying to do. They saw themselves as future heroes who would be praised once their efforts paid off. He put the journal back on the shelf before dawn, making sure it was exactly where he had found it, but the information he had copied was now concealed under a loose floorboard in his room, ready to be retrieved when they made their escape. Friday brought the society members and with them an atmosphere of carnival excitement that made Silas's skin crawl. The guests arrived throughout the day in pricey carriages. They met Thornhill like brothers, shaking hands and shouting their excitement for tomorrow's rally as Silas watched from the kitchen window. When brought to the study with refreshments, he was able to catch a look of the visitor registry. The names listed there symbolized wealth and influence from all over the Deep South. The Secretary of the Society was Samuel Pendergast of Charleston. Horace Levinson, a circuit court judge from Mobile who aspires to politics. Preston Farope was a Savannah-based cotton broker. Silas memorized the names of 3 rich planters from Louisiana and Mississippi, as well as Dr. Elias Grimsley, an anatomy professor at a medical college in Richmond. They weren't extremists on the periphery. Respectable by all standards, these men were well-established members of society who came together to observe privately funded human experimentation that they would publicly denounce. Esther and the kitchen crew prepared sumptuous dinner on Friday night, using up a month's worth of supplies. Silas, who was expected to serve at the table with Marcus, remained silent as the guests talked about what they expected from the demonstration. With his jowls trembling, Judge Levinson admitted, "I confess skepticism about the transfusion method. Blood transplant attempts in the past have always ended in death." "Edmund, how is your process different?" Thornhill responded, pointing to his wine glass. "The purification process. Dr. Rutledge has created a technique for handling donor blood that eliminates specific humoral traits while maintaining essential components. Instead of being a foreign substance, the recipient's body absorbs it as raw vitality, and you can show that they have improved." This from Dr. Grimsley, who appeared to have witnessed many failed experiments himself based on his icy gaze. "My wife is evidence. She was unable to get out of her chair 3 months ago. She managed the stairs without help and joined us at the table tonight. She is 40 pounds lighter now. Her overall vitality has returned, and her breathing has returned to normal, all from a single process of transfer." At the far end of the table, Vigilia grinned brightly. She did appear different from the person Silas had initially seen. Her cheeks had turned red again. She moved with less effort, and there was a brightness in her eyes that had not been there before. "Remarkable," whispered Preston Fairhope. "And tomorrow's demonstration will involve dual donors. We will be taking blood from both donors in precisely measured quantities, processing it through the purification apparatus, and introducing it to the recipient in controlled stages. According to our theory, simultaneous transfer from 2 sources will yield even more dramatic results." Judge Levinson inquired, "We anticipate at least one will survive with adequate recovery time. The entire procedure should take about 3 hours, and the donors survive this. Complications could arise for the other, but that is a legitimate research result. If replacements are needed, we have more subjects available." As he poured wine, Silas's palms trembled at the nonchalant mention of human lives as disposable study materials. Silas could sense the anxiety emanating from Marcus, who stood next to him, but he remained still. Marcus and Silas found some alone time in the kitchen after dinner, while the rest of the company retired to the drawing room for brandy and cigars. Marcus muttered during the demonstration, "Tomorrow night. We leave at that point." "We can't abandon Abel," Silas said. "We can't save everyone, Silas. We'll be caught right away if we attempt to free him during the procedure. Then throughout the process we do not release him. When they are distracted by whatever happens, we release him. We'll hide in the chaos." Marcus shut his eyes. "For a man who may already be too injured to make it through the journey, you are asking us to risk everything. I'm pleading with us to surpass them and to keep in mind that every life counts even when the law says otherwise." They were silent for a long time. Marcus nodded at last. "The travel materials are concealed in the smokehouse by Celia. At midnight, the wagon will be waiting on the river road 2 miles to the north. Before they realize we're gone and begin looking, we have 4 hours. It's all we have, but it's not much. The horror in Thornhill Manor gets worse just when we think we've seen it all. If this tale is, send this video to a friend who enjoys dark mysteries if it's giving you chills. Please remember to subscribe so that you don't miss any more stories like this one. And hit the like button to show your support for our material. Together, let's find out what comes next. The air felt solid due to the heavy humidity that came on Saturday evening. The laboratory in the basement had been set up for onlookers, with chairs placed in a walk in a semicircle around the two exam tables. The room felt both clinical and terrifying, due to the theatrical brightness produced by the additional lamps. Abel and Silas were taken down individually. As Isaiah assisted him onto one of the tables, Abel was sobbing quietly, tears running down his cheeks. Without help, Silas scaled his table, his jaw clenched, his thoughts fixed on survival and what would follow. As if they were theatergoers waiting for a show, the society members filed in and took their seats. They were ready to record everything they saw, so they brought notebooks and pencils. Thornhill set up the instruments while Dr. Rutledge, in his blood-stained leather apron, went into great detail about the process. What you are going to see, gentlemen, is the result of decades of study into the nature of human vitality. My colleague's wife, who has a degenerative illness that traditional medicine is unable to treat, will be the sole recipient of the simultaneous life force transfer from two donors. He pointed to Vigilia, who had been sitting close to the tables in a specially made recliner. Her hair was loose, she wore a plain white gown, and her face was one of excited expectation. Targeting the main blood vessels, the procedure starts with exact incisions made at 4 different locations on each donor. The blood passes through our purification system, which eliminates unique traits while maintaining essential components. After that, the receiver receives the cleansed vitality via a carefully monitored transfusion. To avoid the donors becoming fatally exsanguined, the entire process is closely watched. From each donor, how much blood will you draw? With his pencil poised over his notebook, Dr. Grimsley posed the question. The recipient was given about 3 pints from each for a total of 6 pints. Although this is more than the volume used in the last successful procedure, our calculations indicate that the recipient can absorb this amount with a significant impact. And Rutledge grinned icily if the donors couldn't bear to lose 3 pints. By then, we will have determined the maximum amount that can be donated sustainably, which is useful information in and of itself. Gentlemen, science demands sacrifice. That's how progress works. With merciless efficiency, the process got underway. With a speed that betrayed a great deal of practice, Rutledge made the incisions on both donors at the same time. In the lamplight, blood was thick and dark as it streamed into the glass reservoirs. The sound of Abel's scream reverberated throughout the lab, causing a number of onlookers to squirm in their seats. Refusing to make a sound that would satisfy them, Silas bit down on the leather strap they had given him. His body was still healing, therefore the pain was worse than the previous time. The laboratory darkened at the edges of his vision, and every heartbeat sent pain through his limbs. He could hear Thornhill responding with Abel's vital signs, hear Rutledge shouting out measures, and hear the members of the society whispering questions and observations. 3 pints. Each of them was having 3 quarts of blood drawn. And this was too much, Silas knew for sure. With less volume, the initial procedure had brought him to the brink of death. As these men observed and made notes, this would kill him, kill Abel, and kill them both. Then, however, an unforeseen event occurred. Vigilia began to convulse as the cleansed blood started to enter her veins and her body began to absorb the transferred vitality. Her back arched, her fists gripped the armrests of the chair, and a sound that was more primordial than a scream or groan came out of her throat. Rutledge yelled, "Edmund," her heart pounding. "It's becoming dangerously worse." Thornhill's voice was tight with alarm as he called out, 140 beats per minute, 150, 160. Tachycardia is what this is. The transfusion has to end. Not quite yet. We're almost done with the move. She's still getting used to the higher volume. However, Vilia's seizures got worse. Her eyes rolled back until only the whites were visible, and foam formed at the corners of her lips. The members of the society were now standing. Some retrenchment toward the steps, others a closer approach for better observation. Thornhill ordered, "Stop the procedure," leaving Abel's table to hurry to his wife's side. "It's Constance who's dying." At last, Rutledge turned the valves to stop the flow. "Stop it now." However, the harm had already been done. Vigilia's entire body tensed up, each muscle tensing up, and then abruptly went limp. Abel's whimpering and the sound of blood still flowing into the reservoirs were the only sounds in the ensuing complete silence. Seeking a pulse, Thornhill put his fingers to his wife's throat. His face turned pale. Rutledge moved to examine Vigilia, his hands moving with clinical precision despite what might have been panic in his eyes. No, this cannot be happening. Constance, do something. Cardiac arrest. The intensity and volume of the transfer were too much for the heart to handle. I'm sorry, Edmund, but she's gone. Chaos broke out in the lab. In an obvious attempt to disassociate themselves from the botched experiment, members of the society yelled questions, some demanding answers, and others already heading for the stairs. With his hands trembling and his face a mask of incredulity, Thornhill stood motionless next to his wife's body. Marcus and Isaiah moved toward the examination tables, but nobody saw them amid the bustle. Nobody noticed them hurriedly applying strips of cloth to Abel's and Silas's wounds. Nobody saw Celia show up at the door of the lab carrying bundles of supplies. Marcus hissed now, assisting Silas in leaving the table. Marcus kept Silas upright when his legs almost failed him. For Abel, who could hardly stay aware, Isaiah did the same. They made their way to an area of the lab that was unguarded due to the pandemonium. A second door, which led to the tunnel system Silas had discovered during his observations, was located behind a tall cabinet. It was utilized to transport supplies and most likely to get rid of bodies after unsuccessful experiments. It smelled of decay and earth, and the tunnel was dark. Leading the charge with a lone light, Marcus moved as fast as the injured men would allow. They could hear Thornhill's voice increasing in agony and wrath, as well as cries coming from the laboratory behind them. Hill, as she stood at Abel's side, Celia said, "Remember, we're leaving soon. They'll come after us with guns and dogs when he does." "Then we move quickly," Marcus remarked somberly. "The north field is where the tunnel ends. From there, the river road is a half-mile walk through the woods." However, Silas halted, resting heavily on the wall of the tunnel. The caged man. "We can't abandon him." "There's no time, Silas. We can choose who we are at any time." "Please, Marcus." Marcus doubled back toward a side passage while muttering curses. He reappeared 2 minutes later, holding up a skeletal figure with vacant eyes. The trapped man's body was depleted from months of testing and incarceration, making him lighter than he should have been. After the stench of the basement, the scent of magnolias was nearly overpowering as they emerged from the tunnel into the cool night air. They heard screams getting louder behind them. Thornhill had found their way out. The trek through the forest was excruciating. With each stride, Silas's legs felt like they may give out. The trapped man had to be dragged while Abel slipped in and out of consciousness. However, Celia acted with fervent resolve, and Marcus was aware of every route and secret trail. They arrived at the river road just as the manor's bells started to ring, signaling elevated. A free black man named Josiah was driving a covered wagon in the shadows. He made no inquiries and merely motioned for them to get inside. Josiah said, "There is a checkpoint 5 meters north," as the wagon stumbled ahead. "You will have to remain completely silent. We get past that, then we have a chance." With tarps and grain sacks covering them, they huddled in the wagon bed. Beside him, Silas could feel Abel's ragged breath, felt the silence of the man in the cage. He sensed that his own awareness was about to fade. He held tight to the documents concealed within his shirt, the duplicated journal entries that demonstrated the events at Thornhill Manor. It was a scary checkpoint. Lanterns swinging near, voices outside, and a question about Josiah's cargo. Josiah's paperwork, however, was in order. His demeanor was composed. After several minutes, the wagon moved forward once more. For 3 days, they moved from safe house to safe house, always heading north, through the network of underground railroads. Abel's strength returned. Although the man in the cage never spoke, his eyes started to focus and reveal some knowledge of his surroundings. And in spite of his frailty, Silas devoted hours every night to supplementing his written testimony, recording all that he had seen. Conclusion. During the fall of 1841, a booklet, Medical Atrocities in the Southern States, Silas's testimony regarding Thornhill Manor was published in Philadelphia. The American Anti-Slavery Society published it and disseminated it across the northern states. The leaflet described systematic human experimentation by the Society of Medical Inquiry and included affidavits from 3 escaped slaves, detailed testimonies, and copied journal entries. It was immediately condemned as abolitionist by the Southern press, propaganda that said the testimony was made up. However, it was impossible to entirely reject the testimony due to the degree of medical detail, the specificity of the names and procedures, and most damning of all, the existence of a real victim, a man whose body bore the wounds of the experiments detailed. Investigators were dispatched to Dallas County by a number of northern newspapers. Thornhill Manor was discovered deserted, with the colonel running away to pieces unidentified after his wife passed away. Traces were still present despite the basement laboratory's hasty clearance. More importantly, the burials were discovered in the woods outside the North Field. There were 7 unmarked graves with human remains that appeared to have undergone surgery. In the South, the Society of Medical Inquiry quietly disbanded, but the scandal was never fully acknowledged. A number of well-known members quit their public posts. Judge Levinson dropped out of the bid for office. Some claim that Dr. Rutledge vanished to Europe, while others claim that he vanished to South America. In December 1841, Silas, Abel, and the man they had saved from the cage arrived in Canada. The man in the cage, whose real name was Samuel, gradually recovered his speech and lived for 3 more years before his injured body eventually collapsed. However, he was free during those years, and his testimonies before Canadian abolitionists fueled the burgeoning anti-slavery campaign. Regarding what he had seen, Silas never ceased recording, writing, or talking about it. For many years, abolitionist literature referenced his testimony as a reminder of what happens when certain people are given complete control over others. The surgical tools discovered in 1923, 82 years after they were discovered beneath Thornhill Manor after being buried, they were later given to a medical museum, where they are now kept. A silent reminder of the atrocities that took place in that laboratory in the basement. Silas's copied journals were never found again, most likely destroyed by Thornhill prior to his departure. However, the tale endured. The testimony made it through. Because of a man who refused to let their pain be forgotten, the memory of 7 people who perished as participants in perverse experiments endured. This enigma demonstrates that when people persuade themselves that some lives are less important than others, they inflict the worst tragedies on one another, not otherworldly ones. How do you feel about this tale? Do you think it was all revealed? Get out of here, leave a comment below. Please subscribe and click the notification bell if you like this story and would like to see more horror tales like it. And tell someone who enjoys puzzles about it. I'll see you in the upcoming video. Puzzles about it. I'll see you in the upcoming video.